Greetings, my name is Louise Dente and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is a special as we're joined by Dr. Yolanda Sealey Ruiz. She is the Associate Professor of English Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. Her research includes racial literacy, development, Black and Latino male students, Black girl literacies, Black female college reentry, and culturally responsive pedagogy. Welcome to Cultural Caravan.
Thank you so much for having me, Louise.
You know, this topic is really something that hits home for me. I'm a lifelong educator myself and really have always been concerned about how do we, as educators, create an environment that inspires learning for all learners, regardless of their race and ethnicity. Tell us about your studies, and what you've seen out there in terms of preparing teachers to meet the needs of a diverse population.
Mm-hmm. Well, Louise, first of all, thank you for your service as an educator. That matters. And when I think about the preparation of teachers, specifically teachers for, I'm talking about Black and brown children, what I find most is that there's a lack of historical literacy. There's a lack, on behalf of the teacher, of really understanding the historical backgrounds of the children that they're serving. And so in addition to the lack of historical literacy, I find that there's a lack of cultural literacy. And that brings us to culturally responsive education. The idea and the hope, at least when I'm teaching students, is to have them understand that they have to not just honor and have respect, they have to have a deep knowledge about the children who are in front of them if they're interested in really impacting their learning.
We have heard stories of teachers teaching, particularly teachers outside of our community, teaching about slavery or teaching about topics and having our children portray our ancestors during that very hard, very difficult time in American history. Talk to us about what goes into sensitizing teachers, particularly teachers outside of our community, about how they interact with children of color, particularly African children.
Well, first of all, thank you for bringing that up. And what I want to say is that that is inappropriate. And I'm going to be direct to say, particularly if you identify as white, to initiate that type of lesson in the classroom, you would have to have a deep historical literacy around enslavement. You would have to, what I think is most important, have done an archaeological dig of where that issue lives within you. And this is the work that I do, right? I ask teachers to do this idea of the archaeology of the self, that you have to dig deep to really understand where issues of racism, classism, and in this particular scenario, where anti-Blackness lies in you. Because the enslavement project was all about anti-Blackness. It was about dehumanization of Blacks and about believing that Blacks were inferior. So unless you fully understand that, I don't think any teacher, particularly white, I'm going to say Black as well, should engage in that type of lesson without a proper pre-lesson, without giving students an opportunity to discuss, to dig deep within history and have multiple sides of it, not just the enslavement piece. Let's also talk about the resistance. I mean, this has to really be done well. And then you can have, perhaps, you can figure out the appropriate way to discuss it. I think a reenactment of children standing on auction blocks, no, that's not appropriate.
Now, in addition to that, you have situations where, let's talk about preparing the teacher. How do you basically, some teachers will say, I'm not racist, some of my best friends are of African descent, or so forth. What type of ways do you have people confront their own racism?
Sure. First, I want to say that one's proximity to Blackness does not mean that you're not racist. And if we understand racism, we understand that racism is race plus power. And the way that race has been constructed, and we know that it is a social constructed in this country, is by Europeans, by whites. So that's the first thing. Let's just start again. I keep bringing up historical literacy. Khalil Muhammad, who was the former director at the Schomburg and is now a professor at Harvard and Radcliffe, talks about this need for historical literacy. Now, when I teach teachers, again, I want to go back to this idea of archaeology of the self. You have to do a deep dig and dive on where these issues live within you, or you will not be responsible in your teaching. And in fact, you will exact harm. Because if you're not fully understanding what it is that you're attempting to teach, then you will most likely say something racist and cause trauma. And so that's my idea of racial literacy. That's one of the areas of my research. And quite simply, racial literacy is engaging people in learning about racism and being able to constructively have conversations around race and racism. It's a literacy. This is the literacy of knowing how to talk about race and racism.
Now, when we talk about that in terms of cultural sensitivity, let's talk about it from the perspective of what our children what baggage they come with, in terms of their own self-esteem, their own self-acceptance. What are some of the things that even at home take place that basically impact on how children perceive themselves and definitely impacts on how others perceive them?
Okay, well, to go with the metaphor of bags, the first bags or luggage in terms of identity was put on Black people by the enslavement process. So that's the first thing, and it's perpetuated through the media, through whether it's magazines or television shows. And so the first thing is that we're living in a country and a place and a space that's telling us who we're supposed to be, and then offering other images that if you are like this image, then you will just be a complete human being. And those are lies. And so the first baggage, I want to say, comes from the social environment that particularly Black children and brown children are being raised in. I want to go back to that same original suitcase because that is also what plays out in the home, right? And we can talk about these stories within our own families. Some of the things that we've said to each other growing up about our complexions or our hair texture, that doesn't organically come from the Black family, right? So that comes from the luggage, the stereotypes that the media puts in our heads, and we exact on each other. And so in the same way, when you go into a school, if a teacher is not aware of the stereotypes, is not aware of a balance of history, again, there's enslavement, but there's also the resistance, for example, then you're going to continue to exact harm. You're going to look at a child in a particular way and believe you're not acting like this, so therefore you will never be successful. So that's a little bit of what our children are dealing with, while we are in a hyper-standardized movement of testing, and oftentimes with teachers that have deep biases and a lack of cultural understanding.
And I say that particularly, it's not just people outside of our community, also people within our community, because one of the things about being in New York, there is a diversity even amongst those of us of African descent. A lot of people think that we're all from one part of the world, but we come from, those of us from the African American experience, those of us from the Caribbean, from Africa, and even within our diversity, there are also stereotypes. They're all that we have. So if I am not familiar with the history of Africans here, sojourn in America, and I'm coming from another culture, I might perceive a particular child who is American a certain way because maybe that's not the way children were in the culture I came from. So how do we even deal with those intercultural issues in terms of people of African descent dealing with each other?
I think about the role that racism has played when we think about the cultural identities of children, of young people, of adults. And what racism has done is flatten our experience. And we can be Black folks across the diaspora, Black folks with a Caribbean background, Black folks of mixed race background. But one thing that racism does is that it flattens our experience and makes us all Black people. Now, to some extent, our unity, has helped us, certainly to not just survive, but to thrive. But that flattening of experience also takes something from us, because there's beauty in a Caribbean background. There's beauty in, being, let's say, from the diaspora, perhaps in France, but there's never an opportunity. I think what happens, particularly in this country, Again, I'm going back to the media. Who gets spaces? Who gets an opportunity to tell stories? Stories are told through movies and so forth. And there seems to be an opportunity for there to be multiple stories told about being Irish, about being Irish Catholic, about being, again, from France. But when it comes to our story, it seems to be this, what Chimamanda Adichie says, this single story. And we all know that there's a danger in that. So I think we need to look at the way this country began, when the way that Black people were imagined at that time. And although we have resisted, in many ways we've thrived in multiple areas, we are still working against this. And that takes work and courage and education.
In terms of, as you know, there has a move afoot, particularly here in New York, to ensure that teachers are given the culturally responsive pedagogy needed. Talk about some of those strategies that are now being used across New York and hopefully across the country at some point.
It's a beautiful thing that's happening in New York. I think what's most beautiful is the fact that there was a group of parents who were behind this, activist parents. And I certainly want to CESJ is a particular group that are of parent activists that really put pressure on the mayor and put pressure on the New York City Department of Education. And much like in the 60s, when students were going to colleges and they said, you know what, I'm studying here, but I do not see myself reflected in the curriculum. I do not see myself reflected in the textbooks, and I want to see myself. And we know how history tells us, you know, Ithaca College, Cornell, you know, City University, you know, students locking themselves within City University and saying, no, we want a different type of curriculum. So in some ways, it's that same spirit. And so parents have led this, and there are other educators who are activists as well. And the beautiful result was about 22 million, I think, earmarked for implicit bias and culturally responsive education professional development. And so we're in the midst of that. And there's been some resistance. Anytime you try to interrupt the status quo, you know there will be resistance. But we also understand that it's overtime. It's overtime for a change.
So in alignment with what you're stating in terms of there's a need to ensure that children are, and their cultural diversity and in their diversity is respected, even interracially, how we respect each other as people of a diversity, a diaspora. What would you say to that person, that educator out there who's entering into this field of education and wants to know what do they need to do to prepare themselves to be in front of a group of Black and brown children on a day-to-day basis? What is one of the first things? Give them the top 5 things that educator outside of the community might need to do.
Okay, so let me think about the first top 5 things. The first, I would just hit them academically speaking, that there's over 50 years of research that talks about if a child sees their culture reflected, that they are going to take more risk in that classroom, they're going to feel safer in that classroom, and they're going to feel brave in that classroom. So I would hit them academically and have them look at the theory and take a look at the research that supports this. The second thing is, it goes back to what I was saying before in terms of the archaeology of the self. Why have you decided to teach? This is what I ask my students. And why are you teaching, where you're teaching, and who you've decided to teach? So if you don't know the answers to those questions, you have to go somewhere and sit down and find them out. And specifically, if you are, and I want to say this, and this was the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings in her book, The Dream Keepers. She shows us that both white and Black, and I don't mean to be binary, because I do understand that people are mixed race and multi-race and Asian, but specifically her book looked at white teachers and Black teachers, both of whom were excellent teachers of Black children, and boys in particular. So I don't want to just say that, you know, Black teachers or Latinx teachers can only teach our children. I mean, the workforce is 90% white female and under 30. So if we're working with those kind of statistics, then it's important that they understand why they're doing this and to get it right. So that's number 2. Number 3, you know, I think about morality. And I think about the world that we're in and the way that this world, through white domination and supremacy, have painted black and brown children. Historically, how communities, land has been taken. I'm thinking about our indigenous brothers and sisters. I'm thinking about the sins that fall on this country. And to be a teacher is a very powerful position. To be a teacher puts you in front of children where you can offer up a different truth. And so I like to ask them, are you interested in truth seeking and in truth telling? Mm-hmm. So that would be the third thing. The courage to tell the truth. Number 4, I would ask them, do they consider themselves a mentor? Because much of what we do as teachers, we do a lot of things as teachers, but mentoring is a huge component. Mm-hmm. And I want to say mentor and being an advocate. So I would ask them, are you interested in standing in the gap for a child, advocating for that child? First of all, you have to have the belief, that that child is going somewhere. And are you willing to to be a co-conspirator, as Bettina Love would say, in making sure that that child has great academic success? So do you see yourself as an advocate? Do you see yourself as a mentor? That would be number 4. And number 5, which should probably be number 1, I would ask them, do you love children? Because fundamentally, if you don't have a critical love for the children you're serving, you should not be teaching.
Well, I think that you've definitely hit it on the head, and I think certainly for those out there considering teaching careers, need to really connect, and I'm saying whoever you are, whether you're black, whether you're white, whoever, you need to basically connect with who you are. Yes. And whether you can see those children as your own. Yes. That's the thing. When I was teaching, and I still teach, but I saw each child as one of my own. I don't care what background. That was and how do I want that child, I want my child to be taught is the way I taught your child. And so that's the bottom line. Right. In terms of looking at, and I know that there's the whole thing on the black male, particularly the Black Male Initiative. What are some of the key things as we close out that people need to consider when they're teaching the black male child, particularly? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think when teaching the black male child in particular, teachers have to, I'm going to go back to history once again, is have a historical literacy around the black male body and the intense anti-blackness that has always existed since 400 years. We're in 400 years, 1619 until now. So again, there has to be an understanding of history. There has to be an understanding of, I think, critical media skills in terms of how the black male is portrayed in the media, and understanding that young black boys and teenage boys are looking at these same images as well. And so the teacher has to be, number 1, aware of them so that he or she or they can deconstruct them. And again, going back to the truth telling. So being very aware of the way the black male body is positioned, the way black males have been historically treated and contemporarily treated in this country, has to be at the basis of reaching and teaching black males. And I think third and finally, they would have to really understand how school systems have been working against black male students, whether that is overrepresentation in special education, whether that is underrepresentation in AP classes. All of this stems from the enslavement project, and we're living in the vestiges of it. So again, I just keep saying over and over, if the teacher does not have historical literacy and really understand that the things that he or she or they are seeing, and I'm using air quotes, in black children, comes from someplace, they will not be able to disrupt it. They will not be able to interrupt it and really see the full child that's sitting in front of them.
Well, on that note, I just want to sincerely thank you, Yolanda, because I think it's so important that we, at the time when I was, in teacher education, there was not such a thing as cultural literacy. I mean, I came to the class from my own, but I think it's so important that we now confronted and prepare in teacher education.
Yes.
The built-in, the cultural responsive education has to be there, and certainly I know this city is taking the lead with that, but certainly want to thank you for your work, and we
Thank
look
you.
forward to having you back very soon. But for those who are interested in connecting with you, can you share some contact information?
Sure. My Twitter handle is @Louise Sealey, and I'm also on Facebook, still there. And you could also email me at ysealeyruiz@gmail.com. YSEALEYRUIZ@gmail.com. And I welcome hearing from you. Thank you, Louise, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you. If you would like to support these broadcasts, we encourage you to send contributions to P.O. Box 300851, Jamaica, New York 11430. Thank you. Let's welcome Joe Patan.
They jumping in the city, West Indian happy, happy whole time for Labor Day. I tell you, no problem, for we take over Harlem Sunday, eve of Labor Day. Virgin Islands crew in town, St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John. When you hear the cowbell ring, Harlem will be jumping. Hey, hey, Carnival, hey, hey, Bacchanal. The action will be heavy. People from the
My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is a special as we celebrate Managing Director of City College Center for
I realized that to learn about the people, you study the dance. And when you study the dance, you learn the history of the people. Because dance in traditional African cultures used to preserve. And so that the young coming forth learn by age group. And as I said, you know, I'm skipping years. In traditional African cultures, you learn by age group. So you would have the toddlers who will be going around, they aren't paying any attention, but they are, because these rhythms are becoming a part. And then as they go into the initiation rites, everything is explained. Then after the initiation, then they are ready for courtship and marriage, and then maybe baby naming ceremonies, and on and up until they make the transition to the grand ancestral grounds.